Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Being the Best Version of Yourself. I'm your host, Dr. Carrie Heller. Today, we have a special guest. All right, Lauren, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. My name is Lauren Eckert, and I am the owner of Life Solved Coaching. And we provide executive function support for individuals from K through later in life retirement, 70s, 80s. And we are located in the DMV, but also see people all over the country virtually. And I'm really excited to dive into the wonderful world of executive function today and explore that a little bit more. My personal background is in schools. So I started as a teacher, then a school counselor, and really kind of saw this big gap or need in the schools that I was working in to support the executive function skills, not just for our students, but also for the family unit and for the parents individually. And so about 10 years ago, I left the school system and started doing this one-on-one with clients and in group settings. And it's just been so rewarding to see how this type of support can really make such a difference for individuals who are struggling to reach their goals and live life in the way that they really want to. So that's a little bit about me. I'm happy to share anything else that might be useful, but that's kind of a brief overview and background.
I agree. Well, thank you for sharing that. We're definitely happy to have you on the podcast today. So I thought something that might be good as a starting point is to talk a little bit briefly about what executive functioning is, because people use the term quite a bit, but I think people don't always take a step back to actually look at what does it actually mean or truly refer to.
Yeah. So this is a whenever I go and speak or talk to, parents or groups of people, I feel like if you look back 10 years ago, nobody had heard this concept, executive function. People would say, "Oh, I need help with my organization skills or ADHD." I think it's becoming more common to understand or have at least heard of the concept of executive function. Maybe your child has been tested or you've received, an evaluation and you've kind of been told that executive function is something you struggle with, but it does feel really complicated. And if you research it, you can find so many different ways to break down these skills and talk about them and review them. So I find and see for a lot of people when they come to us, they're really overwhelmed to just understand it. And I like to just keep it really simple and think about the executive function process is how we get things done, right? It's how we accomplish a task from start all the way through finish. And it can be, I always say, as simple as getting up and making my bed, right? And remembering the process of how to make my bed and clean my room and, brush my teeth. And the same process is going to help me write a 10-page research paper or get a huge project done for my boss, right? So this process, this set of skills is allowing me to make a plan, think through any potential roadblocks to what I need to get done, visualize what the end goal looks like of this task, right? Once again, this could just be my morning routine, or this could be my huge goal of organizing my garage, which is my goal for this summer. But so I'm visualizing the goal. I'm creating a plan to think about what are the steps needed toward this goal. And then I need to start, right? And so some people are great planners, and that's one part of these skills, the thinking phase, right? Planning, getting organized, gathering materials, visualizing the goal. But then we actually have to start, which is where a lot of people get stuck. And then the process continues from there, right? I have to sustain my attention. I have to persevere and stay on track. I have to remember my goal. I have to be flexible enough to pivot and adjust behavior as I'm, run into certain roadblocks. And then I have to sustain focus and attention until I complete it while managing my time to get it done before a deadline, right? So that's kind of the complex explanation of a simple process of how do I get something or anything done. And so, as I mentioned, some people struggle with that planning phase. Some people are impulsive and just start things, but they don't have a plan. And so then they run into problems. And others struggle in both areas, right? They struggle to plan, organize, and get set up, and they struggle to do and focus and sustain until completion. So that's how I like to explain it. I don't know if you have additional thoughts or clarifying, but I like to keep it kind of, you know, big overview without overwhelming people with all the little intricacies of each specific skill and what they entail. Um,
Yeah. No, I think it's a great explanation. And I think one thing just to add to that is that because when someone has trouble with executive functioning, it doesn't mean that one size fits all. It doesn't mean that they always have the same issues. Because as you alluded to, there are different skill sets that are involved in executive functioning. So in terms of memory, holding information in your mind, being able to get yourself started to do something, monitoring your attainment of the goal, while you're doing something, so being able to check work as you go. And so because people may not have all the same weaknesses in each of those areas, you could have different people with executive functioning challenges that maybe don't present exactly the same way. And so I think that's
Exactly.
why it's really important when you're trying to work on these things to actually understand what about the executive functioning skills, are a challenge or not going as well as you would like them to be for you or for your child.
Exactly. And that's one thing that I think if I look back 10 years ago as a whole, I've noticed a better understanding was I think before people really just envisioned executive function challenges as disorganized, messy kid with, backpack filled with papers and no system, right? And leaving things at school. And that's certainly, as you mentioned, can be one element, right? Or one way it presents. But we also have clients that are very organized, have wonderful to-do lists, are, everything is in place and proper, and yet they struggle with avoidance and procrastination and accomplishing tasks, right? So it's going to look really different and for every individual. And the reason or the explanation why that person is struggling with executive function might be different too, right? For one person, it might be ADHD. For another person, it might be anxiety, right? Or a combination of things, right? And so when we are considering our own executive function skills and maybe struggles that we have in our own life, it's important to step back and think about, well, this might be a strength of mine, right? And now I have to reflect on the pieces that aren't working so well for me, right? So maybe I am really organized, but why do I keep not meeting any of my goals, right? Or why do I keep creating these wonderful plans and have full intention to do them and I don't? As opposed to maybe my friend who struggles with showing up on time and always losing her cell phone and all of those things, also executive function challenges, but presenting in a different way. So I think that's a really good point. It is not one size fits all. And I think everybody could benefit from evaluating their own skills and functioning in this area. One thing that I also share with a lot of clients is that different seasons of life and different phases that we're in can also impact our functioning, right? So for me, before I became a mom, I always said, I thought I was really organized and I had great working memory. Like if you told me something and you were like, can you do this? I would just retain it and then do it. And then I had children and I added a lot, more stress to my life and busyness and all sorts of wonderful things. And I cannot rely on the systems that used to work for me, right? So you tell me something and I don't write it down or put it in my tracker, it's likely not going to happen unless my 5-year-old reminds me because she overheard it. So I've had to reevaluate because of the different phase of life I'm in and say, this was a system that worked for me before, but it doesn't work for me now. And I hear that from a lot of people who are like, I was in school, I was a straight A student, I was so organized, but now in the work world or in my relationships or wherever, all these issues are showing up. And that's just an opportunity to evaluate some systems that you may have had in place that are no longer working for you currently, right? So it's not just that one size doesn't fit all for each individual, but what might have worked for you 10 years ago might not be working for you now. And you might need to kind of reevaluate how you're compensating for certain challenges or how you're reinforcing, certain deficits in your own life because of your circumstances or because of age or all sorts of things that can interfere with this executive function process and ultimately getting things done that you desire to or that you need to.
Yeah, no, those are really good points because I think one of the things that you've highlighted here that's really crucial is the idea that you have to evaluate what's working and what's not.
Yep.
And certainly when circumstances change, or even when you're not aware that they do, just because you use a system at one point doesn't necessarily mean it's going to always work perfectly or as good as you'd like it to be long term. And so by continually evaluating, are your systems working or not, it allows you to start to figure out how can I make improvements? Because no matter how good you are at this stuff or not good, there's always room for improvement. And that motivation and mindset keeps you often working towards making things better. I mean, there are some cases where if things are going terribly, you probably have a sense of not going very well. But
I
I think
agree.
if they're going okay, you may not necessarily think, oh, I could actually do this better. I could save time. I could be more relaxed. So it's still that idea of having a way to check in to figure out how can I do this better to have things go more smoothly, get more done, or whatever it is. So I
Yeah,
think that's just, an important part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's really relevant for individuals who are very high function, like just go, 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 maybe high up at work, and they actually feel or experience that they are quite organized, quite on top of things. But their stress levels, right? And the burnout and the overwhelm, and then they start slipping, right? Like, oh my gosh, I never forget an appointment or I never do this, but my mental load, right? Like too many tabs are open on the laptop, and now I've reached this burnout state. And so I'm not functioning optimally. And I think at a glance, you might have, get 10 people and collect them, and they could look at that person and say, wow, they're so on top of everything. But what's the toll it's taking? And so sometimes that is where people come to us, where they actually, feel that their executive function skills are quite good because they're on top of everything all the time, but it's coming at too high of a toll. This is true for students as well. That might be those straight A students that are spending 7 hours a night on homework and, stressed out of their mind. So it's like, are these systems actually working and serving as well? Or am I just trying to do everything perfectly all the time? And maybe it's taking a step back and doing a little less, or requiring a little bit less of myself, finding systems that allow me to be a little bit more efficient, or to let go of some of that perfectionism or whatever it is that's making me feel that I have to, keep refining and refining what I'm doing, right? So I see that piece of it too, where at a glance, that person might look quite put together, or or whatever others might say about them, but internally, the toll that it's taking to keep that pace up tells me as an executive function coach that these systems actually aren't working well, right? Because it's requiring so much of you, and you've loaded yourself up so much that you're hitting burnout mode, and then we're going to just see, all the wheels start to fall off. So we like to try to interrupt that process ahead of time, and it's great that you're, in charge of every club on the planet, and you're, doing a million things at once and doing them all so well. But at a certain point, something's got to give, and we need to step back and kind of reflect and say, is this process really sustainable, working well for me? Could I be more effective or efficient with my time? Am I building space in my life for relaxation and downtime, which is so needed for our brain to function optimally, right? So I think that it doesn't always, as we said in the beginning, look how somebody might expect, like, oh, disorganized, late to appointments. This could be, a really successful individual who's like hitting all the marks and doing all the things, but at a high cost and not sustainable, and could be done more efficiently or effectively, while preserving energy on the back end, if you will. So yeah, I think that's a really great point for people to consider what that might look like in their own life. Because we can all make tweaks, right? We can all make adjustments to better enjoy life and better manage stress and more effectively accomplish the things that we need to on a daily basis.
Right, no, exactly. And I think this is sort of brings up a good point around kind of interplay between executive functioning and mental health.
Mhm.
That I know you mentioned a little bit before about anxiety as one example, but there are certainly a lot of situations where if someone has weaknesses in executive functioning, I mean, certainly it could be ADHD, but it could be anxiety, depression, OCD. I mean, pretty much, I think virtually any mental health disorder probably in most cases has some impact on executive functioning. And so that's why you really have to look at someone as a whole person and not just look at here's a couple of symptoms, give it a strategy. Like the idea is that you have to understand, someone as a person to better understand how they're functioning, what's going on. Because, if someone's really anxious, you may approach that very differently and how to help make things better to improve executive functioning compared to if it's more of an intentional issue related to ADHD.
Correct. Yeah, and I mean, probably in the last 7, 8 years have seen such a shift with our client population. As I said, before, I think it was more understood of just like ADHD, disruptive, impulsive, disorganized individuals, right? And I think as our referral sources have better understood and grown, and also I think the need in this area has evolved. Over 75% of our clients have a mental health related diagnoses. Now, they might also have ADHD or chronic illness or other things within that, but it does look so different. We'll just take anxiety, for example. With anxiety, often what we see for a lot of our clients isn't that the skill isn't developed or that they don't, have the skills necessary, but that often they're not able to fully access those skills, right? Because when they're highly anxious or overwhelmed or overdoing, when the anxiety kicks in, it's really difficult to accomplish a task, right? And we can avoid, or we can kind of spiral. There's all sorts of things that the anxiety can do to kind of interfere with that process of planning, starting, and finishing any task, right? For students, that might be schoolwork. For adults, that might just be trying to manage my life and get my life in order how I want to have it consistently, right? And so uh, we've seen such an increase in our client population that their primary presentation is with anxiety or depression. And that does look really different, right? Because as I was mentioning before, for some of these individuals, they might be really successful, really, and for all intents and purposes, doing well, right, or feeling well, but the anxiety can make it really, really difficult to sustain that, right? And so often this looks kind of like a roller coaster. So sometimes I'm hitting the mark and I'm doing all the things and I'm feeling great, and then when I am struggling more, or kind of have overloaded myself, or my anxiety is more prevalent or not as well managed, I start to notice that I'm avoiding tasks, or I'm getting overwhelmed more easily, or I can't stay focused and get things done. And so it's very interrelated, and there's so many things that can disrupt this process. But I would say mental health, impacts our, emotional, behavioral, all the different things that we need to do life, right, can get interrupted by anxiety, by depression. And so it makes a lot of sense from where I sit that so many individuals come to us and say, I don't get it. Like I was doing so well, and now all of a sudden with my anxiety is a little more increased, I'm just like not getting anything done, or I'm not going to the gym like I used to, or doing all these personal things. And so obviously in those instances, we always recommend, and it all of our clients that have a mental health related diagnoses are in therapy or have been in therapy to work on that aspect of how it's impacting them. But from our perspective, we want to look at what are the systems and the tools that I can implement that are going to support me, what are on days where I'm really struggling, days when I'm not struggling, that are going to allow me to be a little more consistent, no matter where my mental health might fall or how much I'm struggling with anxiety or depression at that time. So we treat that a little differently than someone who really has come to us with a big deficit in the skill and needs to improve the skill, versus I have these skills, or I've been able to utilize them in certain phases of life, and now this, whatever this is interrupting that process for me. And that's really frustrating because I know I can do it and I know I want to do it, and I'm just not able to. And so, yeah, there's a huge correlation there. And as as I said, this is way more what we see these days from our clients than just kind of your typical, like, I'm disorganized and losing things. We still have those clients, but it's a lot more complex than that. And it can feel really overwhelming and frustrating when you just kind of feel like you're on this like hamster wheel of like, I've done this a million times. How do I keep ending up back here? I know this doesn't work for me. Why do I keep doing it? And, anxiety, depression, OCD, all of these things can kind of keep you on that hamster wheel. And that can feel really overwhelming as a successful, smart individual who wants to move past that.
Right. And like what would you say to someone, like one of the things I hear quite a bit is the idea of, I'm too busy to plan. Like the thought of, I want to just jump into it, guess I've done, rather than take the time to plan. So like what would be some advice that you would give to someone that maybe comes to you with that kind of question or perspective?
That is probably the most common thing that we hear. And it's interesting. There's such a difference between the students that we see, because they're kind of required, like their parents are making them do this, at least at the beginning, and the adults, because a lot of adults and young adults, they're seeking the support out for themselves, and they'll often get started and then just say, I don't actually have time for therapy, or I don't have time for coaching. And it's like, well, then that's a problem, right? Because you've identified this as a need, and I'm too busy to work on these skills, or I'm too busy. That tells us that we need to kind of step back and regroup on our time. But just more generally around too busy to plan, this is kind of a trickier thing for us to tackle. Let's just take someone with ADHD who maybe really has kind of successfully gone through school and maybe early work life with the notion that I do best under pressure. I do best just kind of starting things and getting them done when I feel ready. For some people that may kind of be true to an extent, right? Or they do technically work better. And there's all sorts of research that explains why and how that may be true. But is it long-term going to be the most successful approach? Not usually, right? And so we find that two things happen when we're kind of just being impulsive last minute and not really taking the time to plan. is there's a lot more room for error, right? And then if we run into a big issue, or we've messed something up and we didn't leave ourselves enough time, we don't have time to regroup, we're often more likely to run into roadblocks or issues while it's happening. And then we're having to rely on our, cognitive flexibility and our ability to kind of pivot in the moment, as opposed to taking the time ahead of time to think through those things. What are the potential roadblocks? Or trying to be really like reflective. Last time my boss gave me this huge project, or I had to write this big paper for class, it didn't go well. Like, remind yourself of that, because we're so quick to forget how things went last time, as long as we got to some sort of decent result. So I first like to have people kind of be reflective of like, what is it that, why am I even seeking support on this, or find that I want to do something different. Let's think through how that typically goes for me. And even if 6 times out of 10, I get to that end result how I wanted to, what was that process like? Could we have saved you time, right? Could you have done that quicker? Could you have done that maybe to better to what your boss is asking you, because you had more of a plan? So sometimes it's actually getting that person to a point where they see there's value in the planning piece, because a lot of people just don't feel that that's necessary, right? So that would be the first thing I say, is we have to get to a place where you see there's value in this, because if it's not something you feel you need, we're not going to ever get you planning consistently. But if we can get somebody to that point, and then we find a system that works for them, and we kind of like debunk this myth that it has to be every morning I get up at the same time and I do the same 5 things, and I have this, I write out my little schedule. That's not going to work for the majority of people, right? But we have to find, what does planning look like for you, right? Planning for me is a little more detailed. That's how my brain thinks. Like, if I'm planning a party, or if I'm, even just planning out my meals for the week, I like visuals. I like to write it all out. And my husband, for example, who has fabulous executive function skills, he plans very differently. Like, I don't think has ever made a list that I've seen in my life, but he has a system that works really well for him, and he does make a plan. It just looks different. And so I think it's about kind of figuring out what that planning phase looks like for you, and does it benefit you enough to incorporate it into your life, right? And you have to get to a place where you see the value in it. And we know on our end, and having worked with hundreds and hundreds of people, that once we start just even giving ourselves 10 or 15 minutes a day to just do like a check in, like, what are my priorities? What do how do I need to manage my time today? What have I agreed to do? And kind of like just taking 10 or 15 minutes in whatever system works for you is going to save us so much time when we're like, get those little gaps of time in our day and we're like, oh, I didn't really think this through, but I have 20 minutes before my next call. I'm just going to think about what I should do, as opposed to, this morning I picked these 3 things. So I'm going to call and make my dentist appointment because that was on my list. Right. And so it doesn't have to be this like really rigid planned schedule that leaves no room for fun and spontaneity and creativity, but it can be that just figuring out what planning looks like for you buys you back so much time when there is open-endedness and there is little gaps in your schedule. And we find people are much more likely to initiate tasks when they've taken the time to think about when and how they're going to accomplish those tasks, right? So that could just be as simple as, I'm putting call dentist on my schedule for Wednesday at 3 p.m. I'm just going to put it there for 10 minutes. And then I'm more likely to do that because I took the time to plan. So I know that's a long answer, but I think there's multi phases to it, because I'm sure you see this in your work too, but there's some people who just don't really want to learn those skills because they've figured out what they feel works for them. And I think that's fine for them, as long as they feel they're hitting the mark in the way they want to and need to. But if they keep coming to us and saying, oh, but I'm just so stressed and like, I'm not performing as much as I'd like to, then we might push them a little bit to really evaluate where just taking a little more time to get organized, gather materials, make a plan in whatever way works for you as an individual is going to really benefit you in the long run.
Right. And again, each person is different. And so you have to figure out, like, as you said, what are their direct needs? And also, I mean, in most cases, spending 2 hours a day planning every day is probably not going to be a great use of time, because it eats up into a lot of time. You could be doing other things. So there's a truth to that. But I think there's an idea about, the idea of, you mentioned like 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, having like a daily plan where maybe you spend some time at some other point where doing, spending longer planning once for the week, and then kind of checking in as you go each day and having a, quick planning period. So it doesn't take up too much time each day. because you're right about the idea of if you have 10 or 20 minutes free and you suddenly have to think, oh, what should I do? You're going to waste a lot of time trying to decide what to do as opposed to just having something you can do and kind of jump right into it. And, I also see one of the big things I often hear is that people don't want to make a plan because they feel like, oh, it's not going to work from the start and then I'm going to be off track. But the idea is, use it as a framework. And the
Right.
idea that you may not necessarily, some people do very well itemizing it hour by hour with the idea that, things are not going to work perfectly probably. But, and others, having a little bit more of like kind of, gaps. So essentially like if, I don't know, if you need to plan stuff out, maybe for like an hour, basically allow an extra 15 minutes of a buffer. So this way, if it takes a little bit longer than you think it does, it doesn't throw out the rest of the day. But the idea is also to tweak the plan as you go throughout the day so that maybe by the end of the day, whatever you had written down in your calendar or task list is sort of what actually occurred, but that it may not work perfectly at 9 a.m. to start with that and expect to sort of do everything exactly the way you want. But it's also figuring out, well, I can't plan for everything, planning for the stuff that's sort of expected. So, some idea of how of responding to emails, phone calls, things like that. If you don't plan any time out for that, of course, that's going to backlog you from getting any other work done. If you have a job that requires, responding to emails and phone calls, which I imagine a lot of jobs do.
Right.
So
Right.
you sort
Being
of have to account for
available.
that that stuff that you can't predict exactly how it's going to take, but at least allocate time for that.
Right. And that's where, like you said, different systems, I have some clients where they just kind of pick 2 or 3 goals for the week that they need to get done. And their jobs, yeah, it doesn't allow them to know what their time is going to look like during the day. And then they have kids and everything's so unpredictable. But just trying to pick a few priorities for the week, especially for those long-term things that you just keep putting on your to-do list. And you're like, I will eventually do that. You won't unless you really make a plan and kind of get yourself started on it. And I think 2 other thoughts came to mind. One is those you mentioned, like there are some people who plan and use planning time for a couple hours a day. I actually would argue that that is for most people not effective either, right? Because they are they're kind of avoiding tasks by over planning, writing things out. I have a lot of clients that have like the most fabulous to-do list you've ever seen, but they have never done 90% of the things on the list, right? So we can have people who are great planners that can't execute either. And so that's why I have clients where they're just starting a million things at once, and I have to encourage them, like, that's a great skill that you're able to initiate tasks so well. And where could we be a little more efficient, or where are we running into problems because we're starting 10 things at once and we don't really have a plan, right? So it's about finding what works for you. And I think this is where all the systems kind of come into play, right? Like, where am I tracking? What's my priorities? How am I leaving in time to get things done? And when I have those gaps of time, depending on what my situation or my job allows, am I able to actually push through and get, feel motivated enough or have the drive to get that done? And I think kind of going back to your initial question of, for the people who tell me they're too busy to have 10 minutes a day to get organized, I say to them, then you're too busy, right? We have to, there's certain things we can't control, and, we have expectations, and all of us wear many hats, and I understand everyone's resources are different, and there's certain scenarios and situations where people are just that busy. But I always like to start by having people evaluate all the things they've agreed to, right? It's like, we're so busy and I'm still going to take on these 10 things, and really evaluating, did I take that on because I really genuinely desire to do that and it's going to make me happy and fill me up? Or did I take that on because no one else was going to do it? And, someone needed to volunteer to run the whatever snack stand for the whole season of, T-ball or whatever. So kind of like looking at, where can I create time? Because when I give myself time and I give myself a breather, I'm going to be more effective in the times that I actually need to be getting work done, right? As opposed to this approach, which I think I fall into sometimes too, of just being so busy that I'm going so hard all the time that I'm kind of spinning my wheels a lot. And when I scale back and give myself more of a breather and I'm more intentional with my time, I'm actually much more productive than when I just pack my schedule and agree to do a million things, right? So it's a really unique process, and really, I think it's just taking a step back and asking yourself, where are the areas in your life that you're feeling overwhelmed, or you feel like you're dropping balls or falling short, and could you create a little space or time to just map things out a little differently? And for some people, that might feel more natural, and for others, they might want support with that, from a coach or from someone else that they can be held accountable by, to make some changes in how they're using their time and managing their to-do items and things like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think also to add on to that, the idea of not just about playing, but think about what sometimes people refer to as a focus mode. The
Yeah.
idea, or period of time where you can kind of block out distractions, close out email if you're able to based on your job, things like that. You may feel a million times more relaxed just working on one project without shifting constantly between stuff. Because even if you're kind of glancing at email, your mind may be half on, oh, that there's an email I need to respond to, and so you're not as like deeply involved in whatever work you're doing. So having those periods of time, even if it's 30 minutes at a time, can make a huge difference in terms of being able to be more focused and hopefully more relaxed as well. I mean, it's sort of like, think about if you've ever, for adults, if you ever done work on, I don't know, a holiday or weekend where, you're not constantly being bombarded by emails. It's probably a very different experience than if you're used to trying to get work done during the day where you're constantly being hounded by a boss or some other person, with emails. And so you can't fully focus as much on the work at hand.
Yeah, I totally, and I think that this is another like myth that is kind of formed because we are so bombarded all the time. Like if you stop and just take like an hour snippet of your evening or, think about one part of your day, how much information you're receiving from every angle, right? Like we have our phones, we're getting emails, there's news alerts, someone might text you. If you're in an office, or if you're home with kids, somebody might be asking things of you. And we're just kind of, I think this myth has developed that it's easy to just kind of like keep up this thing while I'm starting this, then I'm going to send this email. And, I found myself doing that sometimes where I'm like, why did I log into Capital One? What was I doing? Oh, because then I saw something, a charge on Capital One, and I remembered to go do this. And I've started 5 tasks, right? And now I've done none of them and I've slowed myself down. So I do think there's so much value. And if you're in the type of job that where you are kind of, managing crises all day or expecting calls, then you can't really plan your day. This is a little tougher, but for most, we work with a lot of companies and employees where we help them build in even just 1 or 2 hours a week where you do just what you said, shut down, put do not disturb on your calendar. You're not scheduling meetings and you're focusing on either big projects that you have to do, whether it's a weekly task or you're tackling something that you've gotten behind on, or even just answering emails, right? Because we are going to be so much more effective with our time if we are staying focused and taking one thing through to completion, or getting to a point where we decide intentionally we're taking a break and pivoting, as opposed to fielding 50 things at once. And some jobs are kind of just like that, yes, but where you can find ways to focus in and complete tasks individually or build time like that into your schedule, you're going to just feel so much less overwhelmed. And I think we just are naturally so busy, and like most of my clients, even people that work for me, myself, I think we're naturally drawn to having 50 things going on at once. And I don't think that works well for the majority of people, right? But it is kind of where we gravitate. So I have to remind myself that a lot. Like, Lauren, you're going to start something and then forget to even finish it because you started a new something, right? So kind of having those focus times where you just go in and you say, all right, right now I'm working on blank, and that's, I'm going to close my other tabs. I'm not going to let anyone bug me. Maybe I need to do that once or twice a week to really be effective with that free time I have to knock out bigger tasks or projects or requirements. Yeah.
I mean, it's like the idea of being proactive with time rather than reactive to everything that's coming at you.
Yes, exactly. And I think what we find too is that for a lot of our clients, even once we get in a rhythm or put a system in place, it's so easy to just, when everything starts going crazy, or like it's that busy season, which by the way is like all the time, right? We're always like, when things calm down in 2 weeks, I'm going to focus on that. It doesn't really calm down in the way that we think it will, right? Especially depending on your phase of life. And so I think that kind of notion of, I'll get to that later, or I'll, deal with that at a later time. It doesn't typically, that later time doesn't typically come. So I think it's about being really thoughtful of, what are my non-negotiables? I like to say this to my clients all the time, and this is something I've done when I'm in my crazy busy season or in my calm season. What are the 2 or 3 things that I'm going to consistently do every day that I stick to, right? Maybe there's things that I can be much more organized on and like on top of and like really stick to consistently in seasons that are a little bit less stressful. But when things get stressful, I find that a lot of people just revert right back to where they had started because that's comfortable for them, right? It's comfortable to kind of go back there, and it worked to an extent. But when we found, or we figure out a system that works better for us, but it requires a lot of us to like sustain energy and focus and be consistent on, don't feel that you need to do that perfectly every day. Pick the 2 or 3 things that are non-negotiables that you are going to consistently do, whether it's around your time management or your routine or your schedule, and do those no matter what. And that's going to communicate to our brain and our body like, okay, it is a more stressful season, but I'm still doing these 2 or 3 things. And that looks different for everyone. For some people, that's their exercise, a healthy breakfast, and like a a morning email check, right? And for other people, that could be really different. But finding a few things that are consistent, even when the waves of stress, then, so that we don't just revert right back to this like panic reactive mode of managing our time, but we give ourselves, like I always call it, plan A and plan B. My plan A is what I wish I could do every day and I try to do most of. My plan B is still going to be a plan. It's just going to be a little bit more realistic when I'm fielding a million different things and have a lot of personal stuff going on, right? So giving ourselves some grace, but still kind of having that backup plan that allows us to be proactive with our time. And as you said, not reactive, not just kind of like panicking and putting out fires everywhere when we could have maybe spent a little time mapping out our week, or at least attempting to plan what was coming up. So I think that's a great point.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think we mentioned a minute ago with the idea of people saying, "Oh, I'll do it later." I mean, one thing I often find helpful to recommend to people is when you really can't do something in the moment, instead of just moving the event or the task to some other random day, take a minute to figure out when are you actually likely to be available to do the task, for example, and then replan it in that moment at a time that's likely to work, because then you're far more likely to then be able to follow through on another time rather than having to play catch up and reorganizing your task list even more, or calendar, if you have tons of tasks or events in there, for things you're not actually going to be able to do at the time that you schedule them for, because you just randomly put them in there to reschedule them.
Especially those things that are a little bit more complex or have multi-step. I think it's really easy. Like I always give the joking example of my kids' baby books because I'm like, that's a project that is always like, I keep adding to my to-do list update, and it's so easy to move it, right? But everybody might have their own version of that in their head, or something that they've been trying to work on, they're just not doing. I also find that if I keep bumping it on my to-do list, I challenge myself every now and then to just be like, if I had 10 minutes, what would I even do towards this? Because a lot of times those bigger tasks that we tend to avoid or bump, it's really difficult to articulate where to start, or they're like required. It's like, well, first I have to call this person, then I have to do this. So even just taking a few minutes to think about when you reschedule it, what would be the first thing I do on this task? I don't have to sit and write it out. Like I said, not everyone's going to be that type of planner, but really asking yourself, if somebody locked me in a room right now and said, you have 10 minutes and you have to start this task, what would I even do? And sometimes we can't articulate that. And that's why we keep bumping those kind of bigger, overwhelming tasks. And so something like the baby books, I decided, I worked on this like, 6 months ago or something. I was like, I have to get this done before my oldest one turns 5. And I was like, okay, if I have 15 minutes next week at all, I'm going to just, get on CVS and place an order, because I had already favorited the pictures or whatever. And I did that. Did I do anything with the pictures after? Not for a while, right? But I kind of really thought through, what did that first step look like, as opposed to just I use ClickUp as an organizing tool. I just kept redoing the due date for it. It would be like Kylie's baby book. And I'd be like, all right, I'll just do that, January 10th or whatever. And so at a certain point I had to kind of ask myself, well, if I were to do that, what would it look like? Because I don't know. It's like an overwhelming task for me. So thinking about that too is like, if I'm going to reschedule this, let's be intentional. And if it's something I actually want to get to in the near future, what would it look like? Or what would I need to do to actually start that process? That can sometimes get us over that avoidance hump that might be blocking our starting of a bigger task, or emotional task, or a more overwhelming, complex task.
Well, it's definitely a really great suggestion. All right, so I guess we're unfortunately getting towards the end of our time for our podcast episode today. And I wonder if you have any final thoughts to share with our listeners.
I think, kind of going back to what I said about the different seasons of life, and just kind of when I think more of like the bigger theme of when I talk to new clients, of just wherever you are, it's okay. And whether you're concerned about yourself or your child, right? It's never too late to make adjustments and changes. And if you are one of those people, and we all experience this to a degree, but if you're one of those people who feels like you're constantly trying to do things or make changes, and you end up right back where you started, and you're so frustrated and down on yourself, I would just encourage you that every attempt, every time that you're trying to make adjustments, you can learn something and you can grow, and you're building that resilience, which to me is the most crucial key skill that anyone could have to be successful. And so I just want to encourage anyone who's listening that feels like, I'm so overwhelmed. I'm letting everyone down. I'm not meeting expectations in the way I want to. I'm not reaching my goals, or whatever it is that you feel like you're struggling with. It's not too late to make adjustments. We have clients in their 80s that come to us that are, in a different phase of life and wanting to figure out how to enjoy and do things differently. So it's never too late to make adjustments. And your efforts and your attempts are not a waste. If you've tried everything and you feel like nothing's worked for me, it's okay. It's okay to keep picking back up and trying something different until you really figure out what works for you and what works for you consistently. So I would just encourage people with that, because when you struggle with executive function challenges and you feel that like you really should be able to do these things because you're really bright and awesome at what you do, but you keep just falling short of your own expectations, just to give yourself some grace there and know that there is hope to really improve and find something that works for you. But also that's part of just the human journey of we struggle, we pick it up, and we figure out how to improve in the future. So that's what I would say, because I know for a lot of people, this can feel really overwhelming. But it's not too late, right? If you're worried about your teenager, it's not too late to get them support or to figure this out. And if you're worried about yourself, you're in your 50s or 60s or however old you are, it's not too late to keep making adjustments and figuring out what works for me in this season of life with my current strengths and challenges and responsibilities that I have.
Oh, that's great advice. And thank you for sharing that. And thanks a lot for coming on today. I guess where can people find you if they want to reach you?
Yeah, so our website is lifesolvedcoaching.com, and you can learn all about the services that we offer. As I mentioned, individual coaching, we have some fabulous group programs. And then we are on Instagram, and you can find us at life.solved. We post great resources and strategies and executive function tools for people to use. And then you can also, on our website, subscribe to our newsletter where we send out more resources and strategies for individuals. So feel free to check us out and learn more about what we do. And again, thank you so much for having me this morning. I love talking about executive function and helping people learn more and understand more about their behavior and their brain.
All right, great. Well, thanks again. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for listening today. And until next time, stay tuned for whenever our next episode will be. Take care, everyone.